Welcome to The Fine Print, the podcast where we explore the law, its impact, and the people who shape it. I'm your host, Riddell, and on today's episode, I'm thrilled to welcome Ms.Kira Berkeley. With a specialization in animal law, she's a co-founder of AEL Advocacy, an animal and environmental nonprofit law organization she launched shortly after being called to the bar in 2021. She was previously also an animal law research associate at the University of Toronto, where she helped launch the Jackman Faculty of Law's Animal Law program, the first of its kind in Canada. Her trailblazing work and unwavering commitment to justice for animals embodies her deep passion for protecting the planet and driving meaningful change. So, Ms. Berkeley, to start us off, what first drew you to specialize in animal law, and could you explain a bit about what animal law actually entails?
Absolutely. So, my interest in this area started at a really young age. I grew up near a pig slaughterhouse, and it was kind of a regular occurrence that I'd see transport trucks bringing these poor animals to their death, and that never sat right with me. So when I was about 12, I managed to finally convince my parents to let me be vegetarian, kind of my first act of animal advocacy. But it wasn't until I heard about the Anita Crimes trial at that same slaughterhouse. So that's a case where an activist was criminally charged for giving water to pigs on one of those slaughterhouse trucks that were on their way to slaughter. And that's when I connected the dots and realized that animal law was a field that existed. So the lawyers that were defending her. And then once I knew about that field, I just knew it was the path that I wanted to pursue. And I went to law school, and that's where I learned a little bit more about the realities of animal agriculture and the industry and transitioned to a vegan lifestyle. So that Anita Krine's case can give you a little sense of what animal law can involve. So such as supporting animal advocates facing legal challenges, but it's such a diverse area and overlaps with a lot of different practice areas. So it can mean anything from helping to protect companion animals from neglect or abuse, or resolving pet custody issues with them, or considering them in your estate planning, or can be more of an advocating for stronger protections for wildlife or farmed animals or any other type of animals in research or entertainment, or just advancing those protections through policy reform and legal enforcement.
Wow, well, thank you so much for sharing your journey, especially, growing up near the slaughterhouse. I can totally understand why that might make you more inspired. And it's kind of interesting to see how you've also adapted changes along the way, such as changing from a vegetarian lifestyle to a vegan lifestyle, and also supporting animals in that direction in your personal life. So, for listeners who may not be too familiar with this field, how do you personally define justice in the context of animal welfare?
Yeah, so there's an important distinction between animal welfare and animal rights. So, animal welfare focuses on improving the conditions for animals while they're still being used by humans. So, for example, that could be campaigns to remove egg-laying hens from being confined in cages their whole life. So, that's an improvement, but those hens are still being farmed for their eggs, often in a large-scale industry setting, which brings other forms of suffering. Animal rights, on the other hand, challenges the idea of using animals for human purposes at all. So for me, justice for animals isn't just about making their lives slightly better within these exploitive systems, but about ending those systems altogether and transitioning away from them. So justice to me is achieved when that will be achieved.
That offers a lot of clarity on how justice can be viewed and your personal view of justice as well. It's also interesting to note the difference between animal welfare and animal rights and kind of having that separation. It might be a fine line, but I think it might be really significant in terms of determining the animals and just ensuring their well-being overall. So, building on some of that, what are some of the biggest legal challenges animals and animal law as a whole face today?
Yeah, so one of the challenges is that they're usually considered property, which really limits the types of protections that can be given to them under the law. So it means that in most cases, their interests are only recognized to the extent they align with human interests, whether that's economic, agricultural, as companion animals, or otherwise. And then there's also major issues with enforcement. So even when we do have laws that exist, they're often underfunded or inconsistently applied or not enforced really at all, or through a complaint-driven system. So someone has to identify an issue as a member of the public and report it before any action can take place. And then finally, lawmakers can be reluctant to push for stronger protections when these industries built on animal use have such significant economic influence.
Wow, well, I hadn't considered it that way, and breaking it down into just a few main challenges really offers a lot of clarity. And I think it kind of shows the different ways of enforcement and awareness and how those two concepts kind of fit into the challenges today. So, on that note, what are some of the major legal gaps in animal protection today?
One of the biggest gaps, in my view, and at least in Canada, is the lack of legal protection for farmed animals. So, those we've been talking about who are raised and killed for food. So, in Canada, the only laws that apply to these animals cover when they're in transportation or at the time of slaughter. So they're really only protected when they're being moved from the farm to the slaughterhouse and then during the slaughterhouse process itself. So most of their lives, while they're actually on these farms, there's no laws protecting them. Instead, what we have are voluntary codes of practice that outline what's considered a standard farming practice. So these codes still allow for extremely distressing practices. So, as an example, it allows for piglet thumping. So that's where newborn piglets are killed by being slammed headfirst onto a hard surface as a permitted way of killing them for euthanizing them. It's commonly used when they're like sick or injured or too small to be profitable within just the first few days of their lives. So clearly that seems quite cruel, but it's an exemption under any type of animal cruelty laws that we have in Canada because it's considered a normal farming practice. And then the last issue with these codes is they're created and they're overseen by the industry themselves. So it's essentially a system of self-regulation and self-enforcement. So, as a result, the law really remains silent on what millions of animals are enduring in these conditions that we would not consider acceptable for companion animals like dogs or cats, even though they're equally capable of feeling and suffering.
That's a very valuable point. And I think just seeing how farm animals get treated differently to domesticated animals also highlights a different nuance in terms of animal law as a whole. And that kind of gap that you mentioned, especially with your example of the piglets, is really prevalent and really highlights this kind of gap in legal protection. So, adding on to the kind of cultural aspect, how do different attitudes towards animals affect the creation or enforcement of laws?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So it's very important because the law tends to move slowly. So it usually follows rather than leads with public opinion. And I think societal attitudes shift first, and only then do legislators and courts start kind of reflecting and listening and implementing those changes. So as more people become aware of animal sentience and that these practices aren't really acceptable and start questioning them, that cultural shift creates the momentum for legal change.
It's interesting to see how culture shapes law in that way. And I think it just kind of depends on kind of culture to culture, I guess. And I think you've broken it down very nicely in that sense. So, taking a broader view, how do you see animal advocacy evolving over the next decade or perhaps just the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think it's really gaining momentum and that we're going to continue to see some significant progress over the next decade or so. So, animal law is becoming a lot more mainstream in Canada, which wasn't even the case a few years ago. Whenever I was talking about this, people would often say, well, what is animal law? I'm hearing that less and less. And for example, the program at the University of Toronto, so which was recently launched as Canada's first animal law program, is a huge milestone and it follows major schools in the US that have already taken this step, like Harvard. So all of those things really signify that it's legitimate, it's important, and we're also what comes with that too is we're seeing more job opportunities in this space than there were when I started my career just about 4.5 years ago. So it shows it is being taken seriously, it's growing. And in many ways, it reminds me of where environmental law was about a few decades ago. So a small practice area by just a handful of passionate people that over time grew and is now a major respected field with government departments, specialized firms, and dedicated legislation. Like in Canada, we have the Environmental Bill of Rights. So I hope that animal law is on the same trajectory. And then we're also seeing that shift in the laws themselves. So in Canada, in the past few years, whale and whale and dolphin captivity was banned in 2019. And more recently in 2023, cosmetic testing was banned on animals. So that's just a sample size of some of the major wins we've had. And that ties back to your previous question about how these legislative changes reflect what people are starting to recognize about animals and believe that they deserve these legal considerations and protections.
That's such a hopeful outlook on where the movement is heading. And just kind of hearing from you that, animal law is being more and more common and widely accepted is such a nice and positive thing to hear. And your examples have demonstrated that over time, for example, in Canada, like dolphin and whale breeding has been banned and now cosmetic testing. It kind of just shows our development as a society. So I'm curious, for those who aren't lawyers but still want to help, what can they actually do to strengthen animal protection?
That's a great question. Actually a lot that non-lawyers can do to help strengthen animal protection. So you can start by connecting with animal rights or welfare organizations in your area. So whether they're legal or not, anything that's really trying to help animals and advance their status in society by supporting their work. So that could mean donating, volunteering, or just following their campaign, subscribing to their newsletters to help amplify their message when they are trying to mobilize people. So that might include something like as simple as signing a petition or contacting a lawmaker about a specific topic at an important time when it's being decided. And then beyond that, just everyday choices in one in a person's life can make a real difference. So you can choose compassionate alternatives that don't exploit animals. So take that extra few minutes to check if your cleaning or beauty products are tested on animals or not, and switch to a brand that is not tested on animals if that's the case, or adding more plant-based meals to your diet. So these small mindful actions can really add up and make a difference to individual animals. And then when multiplied by thousands, millions of people, they can create the cultural and economic pressures that we discussed for the broader legal change.
That's a really empowering message for listeners. And I think that's such a great key takeaway for our listeners that even if you make a small change in your daily lifestyles, such as purchasing a non-animal tested product or switching to more plant-based meals, if everyone kind of incorporates a small action like that, then over time, that magnitude can really help and reach animals overall. So, touching on a more personal note, what has been the most emotionally moving or personally significant case you've worked on, or perhaps something you're currently working on?
So the first thing that comes to mind is one that I am currently working on. So a campaign at AEL Advocacy where we're trying to help a few sharks that are in captivity. So it started with a white tip reef shark named Toothless that we discovered was being confined all by himself, isolated in a small tank in an aquarium store in Ottawa. And when we looked further into it, we found that there are two other sharks in similar situations at other stores within the same franchise across Ontario. And these sharks are very social creatures, so it's devastating that they were isolated, that they're in these small tanks by themselves, just basically as an attraction to get more people into the aquarium store. So we started working on this case about a year ago. Since then, one shark has been relocated to a better environment, and we importantly got the franchise to pledge never to keep sharks in captivity again and to continue collaborating, working with us to rehome the two remaining sharks, Toothless and the other one name is Carlos. I think I connect so deeply with this case because I've actually had the chance to meet both of these sharks in person. So I went to these stores, I've seen their suffering firsthand. I think about them often. And we now have new homes lined up for both Toothless and Carlos. So they're to be transferred to much larger aquariums where they can be provided more space and the care that they need. So while we don't generally advocate for any form of captivity, given the current circumstances for these animals, the fact they can't be released into the wild and that they are just in these small tanks, this is what we found as the best solution for them to ensure like as much well-being for the rest of their life as we can. So it has been a long process. I mentioned we started about over a year ago on this campaign. There's been some hurdles. We had a previous arrangement for Toothless, fell through at the last minute. We've been waiting on export permits, but we finally have one of those important permits, and we're just hopeful that they can be rehomed by the end of this year. And we'll continue to update anyone who's interested in their story to our followers if they want to follow our work, subscribe to our newsletter.
You provided a really meaningful perspective on that case. And it's interesting to think because for me, when I think about animal law, my first instinct wouldn't go to thinking about sharks. But it's interesting to note how animal law kind of covers such a wide variety of animals and also getting that shop to kind of pledge that they won't do this anymore is a really big step into animal law and just ensuring the well-being of animals. So I know you touched a bit about AEL advocacy just now. So could you tell us a bit more about AEL advocacy, why you launched it, and why you incorporated the environmental aspect?
Yeah, so after becoming a licensed lawyer, and I knew I wanted to work in animal law, but as I mentioned, the jobs just weren't there at the time. I was lucky enough to have met a close friend in law school, Crystal Ann Roussel, and she was in a similar boat, passionate about animal law, went to law school for that purpose, and also equally committed to environmental law and environmental issues. And so we figured if what we wanted didn't exist yet, why not just create it ourselves? So we took that leap. We started AEL Advocacy with this idea of bridging both animal and environmental law because we see no one else doing that in Canada, so a gap that we could fill. And the overlap between the two is so clear in so many cases. So the factory farming that we've discussed, which raises the animal welfare concerns, but it also has a lot of environmental impacts and greenhouse gas emissions, that type of thing, affecting climate change, or there's endangered species conservation. So protecting animals and their habitats go hand in hand for animals and the environment. And then we've also found that environmental law tends to be more established and accepted. So the framing the issues through that lens can help us open doors for more change. So when something impacts both animals and the environment, lawmakers are a little bit more willing to listen.
I think that's such a brilliant initiative, and it definitely shows how you've kind of created your own opportunities, not just for yourself, but also to help the environment and animals, which at that time might have not been something that's widely discussed. So, finally, what advice would you give to aspiring law students interested in pursuing a career in animal law?
Yeah, the main advice I would give is really just stick with your passion, even if it doesn't fit that traditional mold of what law school tells you a career should look like. So, animal law is still this emerging field. So, sometimes you do have to create your own opportunities, as we've discussed, but even just smaller opportunities to gain experience. So, that could mean reaching out to organizations you admire to volunteer, or a lot of law schools even have internship opportunities for credit. You can tie in animal law into any major papers that you're writing in kind of unique ways often. So, for example, if you're in a wills and estates class and you're writing a paper on that, talk about how people can consider planning for their companion animals after their death. Just small things like that. Animal law overlaps with so many different areas that you can usually fit it in. And lastly, just surround yourself with people who really share the values and interests that can really help you stay grounded, kind of block out some of the law school noise and lead to some unexpected collaborations or future opportunities in the field.
That's honestly really insightful advice. Just following your passion and just kind of sticking through it no matter what happens. I can definitely see that through AEL Advocacy and the brilliant initiative that you've kind of created yourself. And just kind of encouraging our aspiring law students to keep with their passion regardless of this kind of ever-changing field. We have discussed a lot that it does overlap with a lot of different fields of law, and I think that's what makes animal law so special and nuanced in that way. So that brings us to the end of our episode. I do hope that Carlos and Toothless do find a wonderful home. Thank you so much for your time, Ms. Berkeley, and for sharing your invaluable insights. And to all my listeners, court is now adjourned. Until next time with the fine print.